recognition of Earth Day, we thought we'd do something a little bit different this year. And despite the fact that it's snowing out in most people's windows right now in Vermont, it is springtime. There are blossoms blooming, and the leaves will be leafing out. The trees will be leafing out soon, and the pollinators are active. So we wanted to talk about those pollinators, or at least the domestic ones that Kim Greenwood keeps. I'm really glad to have Kim here today to walk us through a year in the life of a bee and how you might be able to get involved in beekeeping. For those of you who don't know, Kim is our former water program director at VNRC. She's currently the deputy commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Agency of Natural Resources. She's also a longtime beekeeper. She's the past president of the Vermont Beekeepers Association, and literally helped write the book on bees, contributing to The Land of Milk and Honey, a history of beekeeping in Vermont. So with that, thanks everybody again for coming in, and thank you, Kim, for today's presentation.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks very much for having me. Sorry for the flipping slides in the background there. I was trying to get on unmute and I can't see my pointer while I'm doing the presenter mode. So thanks for your patience. Sorry for the distraction. Really happy to be here today. Happy Earth Day to everybody. For many of you, we celebrate every day. So this is a little piece of that celebration that I'm happy to share with you all. I'm going to walk you through a year of beekeeping at a really high level. I would love to have your questions, and I hope I'm going to leave plenty of time for that. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to start with a really basic overview of a hive. So when I'm talking about a hive, you can have this picture in your mind. So the hive body at the bottom there where it says hive body, that's what we call a deep. And that's generally where the bees live. It's where they raise their brood, their babies, and that's where they overwinter. Above that deep is something called a shallow. The terminology is very fancy in beekeeping. So we have the deep for where the bees generally live and overwinter, and then in the supers are where they generally store their honey. And then you have a top and a bottom, of course. So when you're thinking about a beehive, this is generally what we're talking about. So just to set that stage. So I've been keeping bees for around 20 years. I started a long time ago and had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I didn't know another beekeeper except the person I was undertaking this with. And I made every mistake that you could possibly make and learned along the way. And over that time period, I decided that there were probably other people making the same mistakes that we were making and we could learn from each other. So I started a club in central Vermont when I was at VNRC, and VNRC was gracious to host us there for a long time until we outgrew the space, and then we moved to the North Branch Nature Center, and we eventually ended up with a club that was well over 100 people. It was really fun. I made some friendships that have lasted to this day, and that also kind of led me into the Vermont Beekeepers Association. And Vermont Beekeepers Association is a really important team. It's a nonprofit that supports beekeeping in Vermont. And similar to VNRC, it is a nonprofit that is supported by its members. And I would like to urge you, if you're interested in bees, to support VBA. But if you're interested in the work that VNRC is doing, it is a membership organization. And as a member myself, longtime member, I would strongly urge you to join VNRC if you're not already a member. Both of those organizations and nonprofits across Vermont play a really critical role on a lot of issues that we care about. So I strongly urge you to support VNRC. I live up on Camel's Hump in Duxbury, and I have 3 hives. Generally, it's been up to around 10. And the picture on the screen is the book that Brian mentioned. My good friends Bill Mayers and Ross Conrad asked me and several other beekeepers to help them with this book. And it's a wonderful history of beekeeping in Vermont, and has some really neat stories about the role that beekeeping has played in the state and really has had a pivotal role in the country and even now internationally in beekeeping communities. So moving through the year, we are in spring despite this nonsense going on outside. We're in the spring, and spring is a really busy time for beekeepers. One of the biggest challenges is keeping bees alive over the winter in beekeeping. And so getting to the spring and having bees alive is a big accomplishment in itself. So we look for the first major pollen sources that come out are a huge relief to beekeepers, because then they have a food source outside of the honey that's stored in their hives. So while we think of crocuses and daffodils as kind of the first, and snowdrops as first flowers of spring, for bees, especially in this area, it's predominantly maple and willow are big sources of the first pollen in Vermont. So bees collect pollen as kind of their protein source, and they collect nectar as kind of their carbohydrate source. So those are the two primary. Hi, folks. If you
Sure,
can mute.
if you could just slide in there, that'd be great.
Thanks for muting. So nectar is carbohydrates, pollen is
Anything specific?
Please mute yourself.
Right. Gotcha. We don't have a whole bunch of like more flush mount, but we do have a lot of.
Okay,
All right.
I think they're muted. Thank you. So maple and willow are kind of the big pollen sources, and then we move into flowering trees. This is a big, beautiful apple tree at my parents' house that they have been lovingly taking care of and kind of bringing back to life. And it is absolutely magical to stand underneath there and listen to not just the honeybees, but all the pollinators that visit this tree. And it's just a full sensory experience to be underneath that tree. That's a good opportunity for me to make sure that everyone understands that while this is Earth Day and these are honeybees and they are near and dear to us, honeybees are not native insects, and they are but one of the many pollinators that we rely on. And one of my favorite beekeeping quotes is, people often want to get involved in beekeeping because they're concerned about the pollinators. And the quote says, keeping honeybees to help pollinators is like keeping chickens to save the birds. Honeybees are a managed crop, if you will. They're a managed livestock. And while what's good for the honeybees is generally good for other pollinators, it's important that everybody knows that there's a lot that we can do for pollinators that benefits honeybees, and that when we talk about pollinators, we're talking about all kinds of insects and mammals that pollinate as well. And it's important to keep that distinction. So I'm going to be talking about honeybees, but know that we're talking about pollinators in general. And you can't talk about pollinators without talking about neonicotinoids. And these are a class of pesticides that were created in the mid-1990s, and they were believed to be less toxic than some of the alternatives. And now, of course, we're learning that while some of those toxic characteristics that were present in other pesticides and insecticides that were replaced by the neonicotinoids are better, they come with their own costs. And among those are a pretty serious disruption in the navigational systems of bees. It also has a pretty strong impact on their ability to collect pollen and to make their way back to the hive. It also can impact their immune system. And there's been a lot of studies on this. The early studies were kind of inconclusive. And now as we're honing in more on impacts, they're becoming more and more obvious. And in 2019, Vermont banned neonicotinoids, generally speaking, which sounds like great news. It is great news, but it's not all the great news that we needed. So while Vermont banned neonicotinoids, it didn't ban some of the most widely used sources. So for example, almost 100% of the corn used in Vermont is treated with neonics. And the impacts when you're treating seed, especially, the neonics get taken up through the plant and are in their nectar and pollen sources. And corn is obviously not a big pollen source for bees, but there are impacts from airborne spray in when the seeds are being laid down, as well as incidental use of honeybees and other pollinators on corn plants, for example. So while we are, Vermont is pretty rare to have banned neonicotinoids, and many states haven't, and only a few countries have, we still have a ways to go on banning these, and being aware of the impacts is really important for all pollinators. Okay, so moving back to the spring, there's a lot of, and I forgot to mention that a lot of the photos, the ones that are labeled Land and Milk and Honey, would like to give credit to the authors of the book for letting me use those. So this is one of them. I love this picture. So you spend a lot of time in the spring opening up the hives, hoping that they're alive, first of all, and then looking to see, do you see a lot of brood, which is the baby bees? Do they still have honey? Are they starving? What's the general health of the hive? So you spend a lot of time doing that. It's a fun spring activity. And as you can see, often in the springtime, the bees are pretty happy and not aggressive, and you can work them without a lot of equipment. Spring is also a time to make sure that they have enough room when the trees are in bloom, especially when dandelions are out. That's kind of the first big crop in the spring for bees, is the dandelion bloom. They can fill up a super, which is, again, is that shallower box. They can fill up 40, 50 pounds of honey in just a few days. So when they are on a plant source, they are on it and they're bringing in that nectar. So you do need to be aware in the spring and check them pretty often to make sure that they have enough room. And to do that, you add, on the right hand of this photo, you see some empty boxes there. You, throughout the year, add more and more boxes to create that space for them. And I'll show you at the end of the year what we're striving for. And I cannot see your questions, so if they're coming in, know that we will get to them at the end. So in the spring, you also want to be checking to make sure there's brood. So baby bees are in the form of egg, larva, or brood, depending on how long they've been growing. So you're checking to make sure that new bees are being, new eggs are being laid and new bees are being born. During the summer months, honeybees live only about 4 to 6 weeks. And through that very short lifetime, they have different jobs within the hive. They start out as nurse bees, cleaning out cells and taking care of newly emerged brood. And then they move to things like being the undertakers and pulling out the dead bees. And then they end their life flying and foraging and bringing in nectar. And as you can imagine, they get pretty banged up from that. And it's a hard way to go, but boy, they go down in flames by bringing in that nectar. So I talked about pollen sources and how important they are, and bees needing a mixture of nectar and pollen to get through. If they don't have enough pollen in the springtime, a lot of beekeepers put out pollen substitutes, which is what this is a photo of. It's a paint can with that powdery pollen in it. And if the willows are late or the maples are late, you can put this out and they'll take it. And what's interesting is, you know, when the flowers have come out, because they will completely ignore the fake stuff once the real stuff is there, which is kind of interesting, but it does keep them alive. So spring has come, your bees are alive, they're laying, and everybody's happy. This is when nectar gathering kicks into high gear in Vermont. And bees have on their back legs kind of a basket called corbicula, where pollen collects into, and it goes in there passively, but they can also put it in there and kind of pack it in. And this is a photo. That yellow blob in the center is a blob of pollen for this honeybee. And in the summer, it is so much fun to sit and look at the different colors of pollen coming in and guess, and there are guides for this as well, guess what kind of trees and flowers and shrubs they're coming in on. And I one of my favorites is a bright red fire engine red pollen that I've only seen once in a friend's hive. And we believe that was from an American chestnut tree, but it's really neat to see all the different pollen sources that they bring in throughout the year. So bees, one of their interesting characteristics is that they will, if something is in bloom, so let's say there's buckwheat in bloom, buckwheat and most flowers produce certain nectar certain times of the day. So they might only produce nectar in the morning, and the bees will work a single nectar source basically until it's gone. So you might see them on the buckwheat in the morning, and they might be just, it might just be covered with honeybees in the morning. And then in the afternoon, they're not on there. And that's because that particular plant is producing nectar, and the bees go to that plant almost exclusively once they've found a nectar source, and they suck and they suck and they suck, and they take that nectar back, and then they move on to another plant in the day that might be producing another kind of nectar. So it's really fun to watch that throughout the day. In the summer, dandelion flow is hands down the most important first biggest crop. And if you're thinking about what you can do for pollinators and honeybees, not mowing is one of the biggest things that you can do. The plants that grow natively are the most important plants and most beneficial for pollinators. And we're fortunate in that the easiest thing for us to do, which is to not mow and cut, is also the most beneficial for these insects. Black locust in the summer is a really important honey source. One of my personal favorite honeys is black locust or linden trees. Also blackberry and raspberry bushes are an important nectar source in the summer. We plant a ton of nasturtium here, and they really seem to like that. We see them on the nasturtium all day long. Interestingly, clover is a big nectar source. White clover is a big nectar source for honeybees. The red clover, which is Vermont state flower, is not accessible to the honeybee, which is Vermont state's insect. So the red clover is inaccessible to them generally because their tongue, their proboscis, is not long enough to get inside. But the white clover that you see on your lawn is a really important nectar source for bees. So hold off on the mowing, let the white clover grow, and let the honeybees have at it. They also like basswood and vetch and sumac and mints and all the things that you've seen them on in their yard. Like people, it's really important for bees to have diverse nectar and pollen sources. I use the analogy as if you were living on that fake pollen substitute. Yeah, you could live on Cheetos and eat Cheetos every day, every meal, but you eventually are going to see some health impacts from that. And it's kind of similar to the bees. We want to have a diverse nectar source, a diverse pollen source, so that they can get the different enzymes and bacteria and all the things that they need to be healthy from a variety of sources, just like us. On the clover, bees can gain 12 pounds in a day. We've recorded that. So a little honey bear is about a half a pound. So picture 24 of those being brought in and processed by the honeybees in a single day. It is a ton. So these are really important nectar and pollen sources for the bees. I like to call our house the land of a million poppies. I cannot physically, am unable to pull a poppy that is sprouting. So they are everywhere at our house. They are growing in the walkway, and I love them for their beauty, but I also love them because the bees love them. And I have, if this is the land of a million poppies, I probably have 2 million photos of the bees in the poppies. They're really pretty. They come back on their own, and the bees just absolutely love them. I have looked in and seen, like this one, multiple bees in a flower, and basically anything that you can grow that flowers that is either native, which obviously poppies are not, but any kind of flower that you're growing where they're in there collecting, that's a good sign that you should keep growing that because they're using it as an important source. In the summer is also a really important time to get in and check your hive. So if you're thinking about beekeeping, you should plan on being able to be in there at least every other week, probably more as you're learning. This is my nephew who has been keeping bees for since he was probably 5 years old. He's been in the hive with me. And just getting in there and looking in it is a pretty wonderful experience. We can't talk about bees without talking about Varroa mites. The name, their scientific name is Varroa destructor, which kind of says it all. You see that kind of tick looking thing on the back of that honeybee. They go in, they basically suck through the exoskeleton of the honeybee and suck out on the fat of the honeybee. They suck that out. And in that process, not only are they creating a hole that makes the bee susceptible to diseases, obviously having a hole in the side of your body is also stressful, but they also transmit diseases as well. And they are probably the single biggest stressor and the biggest reason for honeybee hive loss in Vermont and around the country, and a really important issue to manage as a beekeeper. I like this slide because the gentleman in the photo on his shoulder has what we believe would be about the equivalent of Varroa mite on a human. I've heard the analogy being like, it would be like having a tick the size of a rabbit on your body, attached to your body, or several of them attached. So the red tick looking thing on his shoulder is meant to indicate what this would be like if humans were affected by this Varroa mite. They are, it's a constant challenge. And if you're going to be keeping bees or have bees, managing that is a critical component of your success. In the summer, we also spend a lot of time catching up with other beekeepers. This is my friend Gib over in Waitsfield, Gib Geiger, who is an incredible beekeeper and educator and often hosts workshops there. So we spend a lot of time coming together and learning as we're kind of checking out each other's hives and sharing best practices. We're also constantly looking for the health of the hive, and you do that by looking at brood patterns and making sure they have enough honey and looking at the bees themselves. So there's a lot of eyes on the hive to make sure that everything is looking healthy for that season. One of my favorite parts of beekeeping is the sensory experience of opening a hive and hearing the sound of the bees coming up and smelling the wax and the honey, and you can see them and you can hear them. It is a full-on sensory experience that is pretty wonderful, and it's the highlight of summer beekeeping to me, is being able to be fully immersive in all of the smells and kind of wonder of the beekeeping. And so it is, while it is about diseases and management and all that, it also is just a pretty magical hobby. Spring, summer, winter, fall is always a threat for bears. This is a photo of a bear yard, now a bear yard that has been destroyed by a bear. And it is no exaggeration that my husband and I, when we wake up, the first thing we do every morning, every day of the year, is look outside and make sure a bear hasn't hit the hives. We have an electric fence here. Even just the other day, there were wet bear footprints in the driveway, and it is a constant concern. So if you are thinking about getting bees, the first thing you should think about is where you're going to put your bees and how you're going to get an electric fence there. And I feel so strongly about this that I no longer mentor beekeepers who do not have an electric fence, because it is just a matter of time before their bee yards end up looking like this. So that's a pretty big factor in whether you end up getting bees, is whether you can put that fence up or not. And it's a constant conflict, and the responsibility is on the beekeeper to make sure those fences are up and maintained so that you're not creating the conflict. And I've been here for around 15 years, and we've had the fence up, and we have bear all around us. There are bear constantly coming through, and I've so far with the fences, we've been able to cohabitate with them in a way that hasn't been destructive to them or to us. We also spend a lot of time in the summer standing around looking. Stephanie, I believe one of these is your husband, partner. I think this is us in the hives there. This is some VNRC crew who came up to take a look, and you spend a lot of time just watching them, watching what they're bringing in for pollen, again, smelling, enjoying the smells, and just kind of being a part of that magical hobby. We also make up new splits. This gentleman here, Mike Palmer, is world famous for his beekeeping skills, and kind of created this method of making splits, which is basically like, if you remember cell biology from high school, you take a hive and you split it in half, and you make then you have two hives. There's obviously more to it than that, but this is the guy in Vermont who really has created this method and is pretty famous for that. Sometimes hives will split on their own and take off and go, and that's how they replicate. It's how they increase their numbers. This is a photo of a beautiful photo of a swarm that left a beehive, went to a tree, started to build out that beautiful golden wax that you see there. And eventually a beekeeper saw it, this beekeeper, who I believe is our current VBA president, went over and clipped it off and got himself a beehive. So if you keep your eyes peeled, you can see these in the woods. We had one here, and I get to drive by it every day, and it was pretty cool. In the summer, you're also checking your queen to make sure that she's looking beautiful. She's in the middle there. Queens are just a tiny bit longer and bigger than the other bees. She is surrounded by her, it's not called a court, it's called her, I forget what the term is called, but it's basically her court. They feed her, they clean her, they basically do everything for her, and her job is to lay eggs. And so you want to make sure you see her or some evidence that she's been there. It is tricky to find her in a hive full of several thousand bees, but like anything, the more you do it, the easier it gets. The other thing we do in the summer is spend a lot of time watching what's coming into the hive, and honestly pulling up a chair, having a cocktail, and sitting next to the bees and just watching the activity, watching the drama, the fighting sometimes, the pollen that's coming in, listening to the sights and smells, and also kind of keeping an eye on, do they have enough room for all the nectar they're bringing in to make honey, to make sure they're not too crowded. So there's a lot of watching in the summer. And then we move into the fall. So bees need to overwinter with a lot of honey in Vermont, because they obviously can't fly in the winter. And goldenrod and aster are two really important nectar and pollen sources for the fall. We Vermonters try to leave between 60 to 80 pounds of honey in the hive for them to eat throughout the winter, because they don't hibernate. They stay in the hive, they stay in a cluster, and they basically, if you picture a cluster of bees, a ball of bees, they move throughout the hive and throughout the winter, move their way up through and eat as they go. And so you got to leave plenty of honey in there for them to eat, because they obviously can't get out to get the food source. Goldenrod honey is, it's delicious. It crystallizes really quickly. And for that reason, it has a kind of a sharp taste. And for that reason, a lot of Vermont beekeepers know that the goldenrod harvest is coming and leave that honey, that goldenrod honey, for the bees to get through the winter. And it's a really, really important source. So as we're, mowing our roadsides, mowing our fields, all of that, every time that goldenrod is getting mowed down, it's removing a food source for not just honeybees, but for all pollinators. And then we start thinking about honey. And this is my friend Mike. And if you look at the hive with the two big red boxes, the two deeps on the bottom, those are basically those and the green one on top of it are basically his to keep for the bees. And then everything above that is honey that he can safely harvest as his own. And that's kind of the hive that's the mythical hive right there that we all dream of seeing, because that each of those boxes has 40, 50 pounds of honey in each of them. And the beekeeper gets to keep that and leave the bees with enough honey to get through the winter. So that's a pretty amazing hive. I've never seen one like that myself, but someday maybe I will. So I'm going to walk you through quickly how you get the honey out. So you see the boxes there, and in each of those boxes that are again called a super or honey super is 10 frames of honey. And this is our honey house. The wood stove is there because we crank the temperature up as hot as we can stand it, because that helps the honey to flow. It's kind of like molasses. And if it's not heated in there, it just takes forever for that honey to flow. So we crank up the wood stove, and I had a video, but I'm always wary of doing videos in PowerPoint. So I'll talk you through this. That bar in the foreground is a heated knife. And my husband's about to take the heated knife on top of that frame and take off what's called the cappings on the cells and run it down. And what that does, if you picture kind of a 3D cell like this with a cap on top, and the cell is filled with honey. So the hot knife takes off that cap. And so you have a cell of honey that's open like this, each of those, and there's thousands of cells in the frames. So then how do you get it out of there? You've got like an open cup of sticky stuff. How do you get it out? So you take that frame and you put it inside this extractor. And this one has the 2 baskets there. So you put a frame in each basket and you crank it. And we crank it by hand because we're hobbyists. The professionals have a motor on top of their extractor, and it spins all that honey out and it hits the side of the extractor. And because the room is like 90 degrees, all that honey drips down the sides of that extractor. And it drips down to the spigot at the top of this photo and comes flowing out of the bottom of the extractor. And then we run it through a couple strainers to remove kind of the dead bees and the bee parts and the pieces of wax that are in there. And again, because it's warm in there, it flows a lot faster than if it was cold. And so we strain it through and we put it in a bucket and we cover the bucket up overnight. All the air bubbles come to the top. And then the next day we bottle it and we end up with beautiful honey. The process for extraction takes way too long. It's not an enjoyable process to me. It's my least favorite part of beekeeping. But once again, you get to smell the honey as it comes up out of that extractor. And it is the most wonderful smell you can imagine. It's like freshly mown hay. It smells very much like that. And it's a really beautiful, beautiful smell. And when you're done, you do get nice jars of honey. In the fall, after we've extracted, we usually extract around Labor Day. We and lots of other beekeepers volunteer at Tunbridge Fair and other fairs to do educational components and sell different people's honey at the Tunbridge Fair. And we sell a lot of honey and we raise a lot of money for the Vermont Beekeepers Association, and we have a really good time and we catch up with each other. And we get to talk to Vermonters about bees and answer their questions. And we have an observation hive there, and you can try to find the queen, and we sell honey and we talk bees. And we just have a really good time kind of sharing the world of beekeeping with people who are thinking about getting bees or have always wanted to, or their uncle kept bees or their grandfather. And it's just a really good time. So when Tunbridge Fair ends, we all go back to our little dens and we spend the winter thinking about bees. And thinking about bees always entails thinking about bears for us and for all beekeepers. So in the winter, this is kind of a late winter photo where the bears, we had gone out, we saw tracks, so we knew the bears were out. We still had a lot of snow. So my husband, the saint that he is, went in and shoveled out all the snow around the fence to make sure that we could plug it back in and make sure that those hives were protected. So that's a big winter activity, especially in the fall and this time of year when the bears are coming in or out of hibernation. In the winter, we also kind of take a peek at what's going on. I believe in this photo, John is doing some supplemental feeding to the hives. I'm not sure, but it's generally, you're checking on them, taking a quick peek in there, but they're flying only in the winter, a couple days of the year. They won't defecate in the hive. They will come out and they will defecate and go back in. And you will be able to see this on warm days. It's called a cleansing flight, and the snow around your house or wherever your beehives are is just covered with yellow little dots from them defecating in the hive. And it's, if they're unable to get out for a cleansing flight in the winter, it can be really detrimental to them. They can develop dysentery, which is kind of the equivalent of diarrhea for humans. And it can kill them. And so the cleansing flights, to have 1 or 2 days in the winter that are above 45, 50 degrees is really important for the honeybees to be able to get out. And the other thing we spend a lot of time doing in the winter is learning from each other, reading books, going to bee talks, talking to other beekeepers, understanding kind of what's going on. How was your bee year? What happened? What did you see? I have a gang of gentlemen who have become very dear to me, and we share bee notes all year long. And kind of, I had this experience, what was yours? And oftentimes the 4 of us who are in different parts of Vermont will have very different experiences. And also at the same time, we could also have exactly the same experiences in that year. And so we try to put our heads around kind of what happened, what did we do wrong, what could we do better next time? And there's always the things that just make absolutely no sense to us at all. And we can never explain it, no matter how long we think or talk about it. And then lastly, and I'll be ready to open it up for questions, we spend the rest of the winter dreaming about these magical insects and what the next year is going to hold for us. And we forget about all the downsides, and we get really excited to do it all over again next year. So with that, I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Kim. I really like that end photo there of the snowy bee.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have a few questions. I'll just read them in the order that they came in.
Okay.
And the first is from Alexis. I know you did touch on this, Kim, a little bit, the native pollinators versus the honeybees, but Alexis says, I know that UVM did a multi-year study on how honeybees affect the population of native pollinators, but I don't know what they found. Do you? I've heard that honeybees are territorial and can have a negative impact on native pollinators, especially those that pollinate blueberries.
That's a great question. Again, worth highlighting this difference between native pollinators, native bees, and honeybees. And there is, I'm so impressed that you know about this study, because it was a really good one. I don't remember the details, but we know that honeybees do have a negative impact on native pollinators, and UVM is starting to understand what that competitive relationship is like and what those impacts are. I don't remember what the study concluded, but I do remember that that honeybees were in some cases out competing other native pollinators, and that's why it's so important to me that we make sure that we're talking not just about honeybees, but native pollinators in all of our considerations. So I'd be happy to dig that study up and let's see where I could put it. You can email me, kimgreenwood@hotmail.com, and I'd be happy to get that study to you.
Great, thanks so much. And I'll share Kim's email in the chat later, and also when I share the recording to everyone over email. The next question is from John. Please discuss whether there have been measurable impacts of GMO crops with herbicides, for example, Roundup, on plants popular pollinators like milkweed.
That's another great question. I kind of feel like I'm a little out of my league there in terms of specific studies, but I'll tell you my personal philosophy, and this was my philosophy when we started seeing studies coming out about the neonics and that they were not showing impacts, is that when you consider how pollinators work, that the pollen is coming through from the plant's been treated. My personal philosophy is that it is impossible that there are no impacts from that, because by design, they are disrupting some of the systems that the pollinators rely on to survive. So I don't know about GMOs specifically, but my personal belief is that any kind of synthetic introduced pesticide, herbicide is going to have some impact. And I say that with full admission that we treat our hives with what are considered organic treatments, but not always, because depending on the mite loads, et cetera. So like it's a trade-off all the time, but there is no doubt that there are impacts from those chemicals.
The next question is from Mark. He says, you mentioned inspecting every week or two. Is this okay for the bees? Doing so, you break open the supers, cut through the propolis, smoke them, risk crushing them, putting the frames back in, the stress of the opening, etc. Advice on how frequently is safe for the hive would be helpful, as well as how thoroughly to do an inspection.
Great question. When I'm talking about doing inspections every week or two, I'm really thinking about newer beekeepers getting in there more often, getting familiar with the flow throughout the season. So you know what you're looking at, and you know what looks normal, and you know kind of the precursors to a problem. Once you become a little more seasoned, I tend to agree with you that those inspections can be disruptive. So we go into our hives about once a month to make sure the queen isn't failing, to make sure that there's enough brood in there, that everything looks okay. But there is a trade-off, you're right. Propolis, for folks who don't know, I didn't mention this, but it's one of the coolest properties in the hive, of which there are many cool properties. It's a resin that's collected from evergreens, and it is an incredibly important medicinal compound in the hive. And and it's basically like a hard wax. And bees will seal up every possible surface that they can with propolis, and they will coat the inside of their hives. And if you are going in there and cracking open those things, they have to go back in and fix it. So there's a trade-off in your going in and learning, and you're going in and disrupting them. And as a new beekeeper, I always encourage people to get in there pretty regularly so you can learn, because if you can't keep your bees alive, you're never going to be a better beekeeper.
That's interesting. Someone else asked, where are the bees when you're harvesting the honey? And I was wondering this as well. We do have someone who joked that they wait at McDonald's, but I have a feeling that's not the actual answer.
This is a great question. And I've had beekeepers say like I put my frames in the extractor and like there were bees everywhere, because they didn't know that you take the bees off the honey frames before you extract them. So the way that it happens for us is, I mentioned those boxes each have 10 frames in them. You pull the frame out. We give it 2 good shakes to get most of the bees off, because we don't want to like shake them too hard, and you don't want to damage them or the brood. And then we take a brush and you brush up, and the bees like tumble into the hive, and you take that frame that is now beeless and you stick it in a box very quickly, cover it up so the bees don't go in it. So then when you extract them, that pile of boxes that we had in our honey house, that's free of bees. So you take the bees off, you leave them. Remember I said that you leave the 2 deeps in a super, you leave a bunch of honey in the hive for them, you shake them back into what's staying, and you take the honey and go extract it elsewhere.
That makes more sense than McDonald's. Laura says, you mentioned some mistakes you made at first. Can you share some?
Oh my goodness. I don't think we have enough time. I didn't know what I was looking for. I didn't do a lot of homework before I got bees. And it was kind of one of those things like, yeah, bees are cool. Let's keep bees. And we got bees, and we didn't do the homework. We didn't learn about the diseases. We didn't ask some of the questions that you're asking today. I didn't know about the Vermont Beekeepers Association, who has in-hive classes in the summer about their mentoring program. There's all these resources that are out there. And I just decided irresponsibly, I was just going to get bees and I'd figure it out. And I did, but I got lucky. And I will say that one of the biggest mistakes that I see with new beekeepers is that they do what I did and their bees don't make it through the first winter. And by the time they realize that they're not going to have bees that season, it's too late for them to buy bees. And so they then lost an entire season. And by the time next year comes around, they're like, you know what, it was too hard. I'm just not going to keep bees anymore, or they forget to order them. And that's the biggest thing that I see. So if you're thinking about getting bees, my recommendation is think about it this year, do it next year, and spend the year in between getting signed up with a mentor through the Vermont Beekeepers Association, going to the workshops, setting up your hives, learning about what's involved, and you'll have a much higher rate of success than most new beekeepers will.
Makes sense. Someone says, what do you do with the wax? How is it collected? Do keepers sell it, or does it need to be sent out somewhere, I guess, to be processed?
I love the wax, and it's one of my, I have many favorite parts of beekeeping, and wax is one of my favorite parts. So we have a solar wax melter, which is a wooden box that our neighbor built for us. And it's got a piece of glass on the top, and you put all the wax in it. And it's on a slant. And so as the wax melts from the sun, it goes down to the bottom and is collected in a pan, basically. And then we take those blocks and we put them in a crock pot in the winter, and it fills the house with a lovely smell. And we pour candles with them in the winter, which is wonderful in many, many ways. It's just a wonderful way to share the beauty of the hive. And it also smells really good as well and lights the darkness of the winter.
Jill asks, what are the organic treatments that you use? When is the proper time to split up a hive?
I use generally, but not always, a treatment called Apiguard, which is oh, now I'm forgetting. I think it's a thymol product, which is a naturally occurring product in the fall. Yeah, I was thinking it was formic acid. Yes, it is formic acid. I was thinking oxalic, which it's not. And that goes on the hive in the fall. It has temperature requirements, so you have to make sure that you meet those temperature requirements for efficacy. And I tend to use that one because it's considered an organic treatment. Although I treat that word with skepticism about anything I'm putting in my hive. And so we treat in the fall, and generally the time to make splits, to take the hive and split it up and make more hives, basically, is a good time to do that is around dandelion flow. And that's because, as I mentioned, that's a super high volume time for the bees. They're getting a lot of nectar, a lot of pollen, and that's when they tend to be building out wax. So I will do it around dandelion flow or just after that in the spring, but you can do it throughout the year.
Someone asks, when buying bees, are a 3-pound package or a 5-frame nuke roughly equivalent?
Oh, well, I believe they are about equivalent. If you're starting as a new beekeeper, I would definitely recommend starting with a nuke. And the difference between the two, so there's a nucleus and a package. A package is a box of bees that comes with lots of bees and a queen that is most likely not from that hive. It's not part of that hive. It's just a queen that's in there. And when you put that into a hive, the bees then have to make all the wax foundation, those cells that I was talking about. They have to collect all that wax. It's very labor intensive, and build all those frames out. When you get a nucleus, you get 5 frames of bees usually with their queen, and she's generally out, although sometimes she can be in a queen cage as well. And you take those 5 frames and you plunk them in your hive, and they already have the benefit of having started with that foundation that they don't then need to build out. And I think it's a better way to start. And then once you have foundation in your hives, once those frames are filled out, you can get package bees because you already have that foundation for them to start on.
Diane asks, what do you think of flow hives?
Oh, I'm dying to know what you think of flow hives. I'm dying to know what anyone thinks of flow hives. So flow hives are I've never seen one, and I don't know anyone who has one, but I'd love to hear if anybody does. So flow hives, you may have seen this, was a big internet sensation. It was a the beekeeping world was all Twitter over this. It's a hive that basically has a crank on it, and you turn the crank, and instead of having to go in and do all that honey harvesting, the cells kind of split and all the honey comes out, and you basically have a spigot on your hive. We all said it was either going to be the biggest thing in the beekeeping world ever or a total scam. And I don't know where we've landed on it, but if you know about flow hives, I'd love to hear about your experience.
That sounds pretty cool. I'd like to hear that too. So Stephen has two questions. How do you manage the Varroa mites? And do you heat or insulate hives to help bees survive the winter?
For us, for Varroa, we do, as I mentioned, we do treat. So we do a couple things. We monitor throughout the year, which is another reason you really do need to get into your hives. So we do what are called mite counts, and you basically take a whole bunch of live bees, and you do one of two methods where you can either take the bees and they are killed, and you take a mite count off what comes off of them as you shake them. Or you can do a live method where you do that same, shake them to get the Varroa mite off with powdered sugar, and it kind of, the mites can't hold on and they fall off. And so you count how many mites are in there, and there are threshold numbers that tell you kind of when you got a problem. So that's a really, really important thing to do throughout the year. And then what was the second part of the question?
Do you insulate the hives in the winter or heat them to help them survive?
We don't, and this is an interesting thing that back in the olden days, people used to bring their hives indoors, and they would overwinter them in their basements in the winter. And somewhere along the way, they started questioning whether that was beneficial for the bees. And current practice is that you don't need to insulate the hives, but you do need to wrap them. And by wrapping them, you keep the wind from kind of blowing through and chilling them. But because the bees keep that cluster that I mentioned in the winter, that small cluster, tight cluster, they keep the center of that at like 90 degrees. So you really don't need to insulate them in terms of providing them with a source of heat, but it's really critical that you ventilate the hives, because the moisture that they produce when they respirate can be very detrimental to them when it falls on them. I think like a cold, wet bee is probably not going to make it through the winter. So there's the ones that you see as you drive around will often have tar paper around them or a thin insulation, which is predominantly for solar gain, a little solar gain, and to keep the wind off and to facilitate getting the moisture out of the hive.
There's a question about, is there a French method of keeping bees where no honey is harvested?
Huh.
Or isn't there a French method?
There could be. Honey does not have to be taken out of a hive. You don't have to take it. They will swarm, which is, as I mentioned, their natural proclivity to the old queen. They make a new queen. The old queen leaves the hive with like half of the hives, and they go off and in Vermont mostly die if you don't capture them. But they can continue to do that for years, so you don't have to take the honey. But I'm not familiar with this method. I'd love to hear more about it.
Does each frame need its own queen?
That's a good question. So each hive, and a hive again is that accumulation of all the boxes that happen to be on it. Each hive has one queen. There are kind of rare cases where there's temporarily two queens, but the current theory that is slightly evolving is that there's one queen, and when there are two queens, they will fight to the death, so that there's only one queen left. So each pile, each stack of boxes has one queen in that whole stack.
That's an image. Ian says, how many times a year do you get stung? Photos showed you not wearing gloves. Don't you get stung on the hands?
I do get stung. It is so interestingly, beekeepers either kind of go one of two ways, that the more you get stung, the less of a reaction that you have over time. So most of the time, although not all of the time, when I get stung, I have very little reactions, just a little pain for a minute or two. Ian is probably referring to the fact that I was stung on my hand when I was giving a workshop, and I had to have my engagement ring cut off my hand as a result. It was early in the season, which is when you tend to react the most. And that's what happened then. I was thinking nothing would happen, and it did. And that we had to have my ring remade.
That's a great story, but ouch.
Yeah.
There are a couple questions about, well, one is actually mine, but about just really basics. So Melissa says, what are the basics needed to start a hive? And I'm going to add on to mine. What are some tips for urban beekeepers, so to speak, or just people who there's nowhere to put an electric fence, but maybe a bear would come through their downtown home, or,
Yeah.
They're just not sure what to do there.
Yep, that's a great question. So many years ago, I had bees on the roof at VNRC. I'm not sure whose office it is now, but I was at the time was Jake Brown's office, and I used to climb through the window, and we had bees on the roof there. And there are bees in downtown Montpelier. My friend Jeffrey and Elizabeth Courtney, the former executive director, have both had bees or bears in their yards, and they live just not even half a mile away from VNRC, right down near the Capitol. So there are bears down there. You can put them on a roof. I had a friend up here on Camel's Hump who put them on his second floor of his barn, and the bear did climb the stairs, but it didn't get through the door. So there are considerations there for sure, but there are options. To get started, if you're going to be in an urban area, you really do need to think about your neighbors. One of the reasons we stopped keeping bees at VNRC was the neighbors were concerned because remember I mentioned the cleansing flights of the bees, and when they would come out, that their poop basically is hard and caustic and can get on vehicles. So you need to think about that. You need to think about your bees visiting your neighbor's swimming pool, etc. So there are considerations about that, but it is possible. And Jeffrey and Elizabeth are good examples of folks who have done it right there in urban areas.
Cool. And the other part of that question was just, what are the basics needed to start a hive?
I would say the basics are electric fence, the bees themselves, and all the equipment, which probably, I'm guessing, around $500-600 to get started. And then in subsequent years, the costs are less. And I would add to that a mentor, the importance of a mentor and having somebody to talk through what you're seeing. And I'll make another plug for VBA's mentor program, in that it's nice and structured. It has some requirements for new beekeepers, which indicates like you have to do more than I did when I started, and actually do some learning on your own, which I think makes a lot of sense. So electric fence, bees, and the equipment, and a mentor would be on my list for things to get started.
Thank you. So it is 2:00, and I know you've got some things to get to next, Kim, but if you'd like, I can we can either do a couple more questions, or I could put your email in the chat and encourage people to get in touch with you, if that's okay.
Yes, that would be fine. And I will just once more urge you all to support the great work that VNRC is doing by becoming a member and supporting workshops like these and all the great things that VNRC does that may be obvious to you, that aren't obvious to me, or may not be obvious to you, that are a great comfort to me to know that there's an organization like VNRC out there advocating for the things that I care about. So again, would urge you to become a member if you aren't already. They're doing great work, and I'm happy to be supporting them.
Thanks so much, Kim. And you mentioned Kim Greenwood at Hotmail. I saw it. Is that the one you wanted to share?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kim. This was really fantastic. And thanks to everyone who attended. Like I said, I'll be sending around a link to the recording when it's available. And I hope you all are inspired to get bees or continue the work you're doing with your bees currently.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you all for coming and listening to me go on and on about my favorite topic.